Hey guys, topic 11 is gas exchange in humans. The objective I'm going to start on is objective B because it's easier to discuss it this way. Objective B is identifying parts of the respiratory system. It starts with the epiglottis, which is that flap of skin or tissue that stops food from entering the lungs. You've got trachea here. The trachea is the tube that goes to the lungs and it splits into the bronchi here. This is shown more clearly here. Then they split into the bronchioles and the alveoli. Shown more clearly here, the structure of that. The bronchioles split into the alveoli, and then the alveoli are surrounded by capillaries, and there's a dense network of capillaries. So that's the structure. Now, the next objective you've got to talk about, we'll talk about objective A, is the features of exchange surfaces. Just before we do that, it's worth having a look at these words because they are very similar but mean different things. Respiratory system is this system of the lungs that we're talking about. It relates to this. The respiratory tract is this tube here that leads to the lungs. However, respiration is a completely different process, and that's the process that you make energy in your cells using food and mostly oxygen, sometimes done without oxygen now. Now, the point of breathing is to take in oxygen and remove carbon dioxide, and there's 4 adaptations that allow the lungs to do that. It's the large surface area, a thin surface, good blood supply, and ventilation. I'm going to use a picture to describe this because it's a bit easier. So the first thing being the large surface area. The large surface area is produced by having lots of alveoli. You can see there's millions of alveoli here, and these are these sacs here, and the shape here provides a large surface area for exchange and diffusion of gases. The next thing is the thin surface. These alveoli are only 1 cell thick, as are the capillaries. So any air that's coming in, any oxygen that wants to dissolve into the blood, has only got 1-2 cells to get through. So there's the short distance. The other thing is there's a great blood supply. As you can see here, there's capillaries here coming with deoxygenated blood that's low in oxygen. So there's a concentration gradient there because there's lots of oxygen coming in to the lungs and not a lot in this deoxygenated blood. So oxygen moves across the 2 cells, the alveoli and the capillary, into red blood cells down a concentration gradient. And then that is pumped away. Straight away it's pumped away, which leaves more deoxygenated blood and maintains that high concentration gradient. Vice versa, deoxygenated blood has lots of carbon dioxide in it, and that's a lot more carbon dioxide than in this alveoli. So carbon dioxide dissolves through the 2 cells, alveoli and capillary, or capillary and alveoli, should I say, into the lung or the air sac, and that does that down a concentration gradient. That air is breathed out, which again leaves less carbon dioxide in here as more deoxygenated blood arrives. The last thing is ventilation. That's breathing in and out, and that just goes again, it maintains the concentration gradient. Breathing in provides lots more oxygen, and breathing out removes all the CO2. So the good blood supply and the ventilation are very important. Objective C is to name and identify the intercostal muscles. Now, they're just muscles in between the ribs that aid in ventilation by moving the ribs when they contract and relax. So external intercostal muscles are the ones you can see, whereas internal intercostals are underneath them. Now, this picture just shows how when the external intercostal muscle contracts, it swings the rib cage. It's like a model of the rib cage. This would be the spine, this is the rib cage, and then this bit is the sternum, the bit in front of the heart. As it contracts, this muscle shortens and pulls these 2 bits together, which pulls the rib cage up, as you can see here. So it would pull the rib cage up this way, which it basically just creates more volume or more space in the thorax so that you can breathe more air in. Objective D is to state the function of cartilage in the trachea. It's horseshoe shaped, so it goes round the front and curls towards the back, but doesn't join at the back. It's all the way down the trachea and the bronchi, and it just stops them from collapsing, so it keeps the tube open. Objective E is to explain the role of parts of the respiratory system in changing volume and pressure. Now you should go into quite a bit of detail on this. Ventilation is basically the movement of air into and out of the lungs. Inhalation, basically what happens is the volume of the thorax increases. The thorax is the upper body where your lungs and vital organs are, and the lower body would be called the abdomen. So inhalation again, the volume of the thorax increases. The lungs therefore expand because they're pulled out, because they're stretchy, the lungs. The pressure in the lungs decreases, and therefore the pressure is higher outside, and so air is drawn in to the lungs. Exhalation is the opposite, so the volume in the thorax decreases, the lungs get smaller, pressure in the lungs increases because there's less space, and therefore the pressure is higher than outside, so air is forced out. Now, if you apply these two things to each one of these statements, it's easy to describe what each one of them does for the exam. The two muscles involved in this objective are the diaphragm and the intercostal muscles. These two muscles, when they contract and relax, that's what causes inhalation and exhalation. The diaphragm is a flat tissue with muscle fibers, and it separates the abdomen from the thorax. As you inhale, it contracts and flattens. So you can see that here, it contracts and moves downwards. What you do then is you just add this part, inhalation, to the end of that statement to get all the marks. As you inhale, the diaphragm contracts and flattens, it moves down, and so the volume in the thorax increases, the lungs expand, pressure in the lungs decreases, and air is drawn in. So you need to follow that same rule. As the diaphragm relaxes, it moves up, space in the lungs decreases as the lungs get smaller, pressure increases in the lungs, and air is expelled. Again, the same rule. Now the ribs, you don't really have to talk about, but I've put them in just for information. They're the bones that protect the lungs, and when you inhale, they move up and out, again to increase the volume, to draw air in, and when you exhale, they move down and in to decrease volume, but they only can do that because of the intercostal muscles contracting. Now, external intercostal muscles are in between the ribs and they help move them. When they contract during inhalation, they pull the ribs up and out. Again, add the statement in there, the volume of the thorax will increase as they contract because they pull the ribs up and out. That draws air in because the pressure decreases, and so on. Exhalation, they relax, and the internal intercostal muscles take over because during exhalation they actually contract, and that pulls the ribs the other way. So the internal intercostals and external, that they work as antagonistic muscles almost. As one contracts, the other relaxes. This picture here just shows how the rib cage moves up and down to increase and decrease the volume. So diaphragm and external intercostal muscles contract to inhale air, and then the internal intercostal muscles contract to expire air. This bell jar model just is a representation of the lungs. This obviously represents alveoli, or the lungs. This is the trachea with the bronchi. The bell jar would represent the ribs, however they don't move, so it's not a great representation of that. The rubber sheet would represent the diaphragm, and what you do is you pull it down as if it was contracting and moving down, and that will draw air in as the pressure in here decreases. So air is pulled in, and these balloons would actually inflate. So all you have to do is pull that, and these balloons inflate. And then when you push or relax the diaphragm back up, the pressure in here increases because the volume gets smaller and the air is pushed out. Objective F is pretty small. All you've got to do is state the difference between the composition of inspired and expired air. Now, basically, when you breathe in, there's more oxygen because when you breathe out, you've used some of that oxygen in respiration. Vice versa, carbon dioxide breathed in is 0.04, but then when you breathe out, you've provided more carbon dioxide from respiration, so it's 100 times greater in concentration, or composition, should we say, when you breathe out. Objective G is to explain that and add a bit more detail. Now, atmospheric air inhaled gives you some percentages here of what's breathed in. Nitrogen doesn't change with inhaling and exhaling, it's pretty much the same because we don't use it. Carbon dioxide again gets a lot higher, oxygen gets lower. Now when it comes to water vapor, it's variable in atmospheric air, but when you breathe out, water from the lining of the alveoli it evaporates into the air and is breathed out, and so air exhaled has a lot more water vapor. And the air is also warmer in exhaled air because due to certain respiration processes that create heat energy. This is a really good diagram to show what's happening here as oxygen dissolves into the blood cells and carbon dioxide diffuses out of the blood capillary, not the red blood cells. You also have to describe how they're inefficient though, because as much as this is a good device and has adaptations for exchange, it is quite inefficient. And this is because most of the oxygen that actually comes in to the alveoli isn't diffused into the red blood cell. It actually leaves the alveoli back into the expired air. And also, when the carbon dioxide diffuses into the alveoli, not all of it is expired. It's called residual volume. You can't get rid of all of the air in the lungs, else they'd implode. So that residual volume has got carbon dioxide in it, and so when you breathe the next lot of air in, you've already got quite a high concentration of carbon dioxide, and you really want to have a lot of oxygen, so that carbon dioxide kind of gets in the way. Again, those two things reduce the efficiency of this gas exchange surface. The next thing we've got to talk about is an investigation, and it's the Limewater test. Now, you've probably done this before. Basically, you breathe in and out using this tube. Now, tube A, when you breathe in, it will draw air from the outside in. So atmospheric air comes in, bubbles through here, and won't really do much to the Limewater. Eventually, it might turn cloudy because there is some carbon dioxide in the air. But here, in tube B, as you breathe out, air will be pushed through this tube, bubble through the water, and then leave through this tube. And because the air you breathe out has got a lot of carbon dioxide in, this will then go cloudy. So tube B goes really cloudy and tube A doesn't go cloudy that quickly. Worth mentioning is that Limewater goes cloudy with carbon dioxide because carbon dioxide adds to the Limewater chemical and makes calcium carbonate when it joins with it. And calcium carbonate is a solid precipitate, which then is the cloudy substance that you see. However, if you were to carry on breathing through here, more carbon dioxide would come through and actually then turn the calcium carbonate, that solid precipitate, into hydrogen carbonate, which is actually soluble, which dissolves and is clear. So then it would go clear eventually. However, I don't think they'll ask that in the exam. Objective I I'm going to miss, and I'm going to move straight to objective J, and it's to explain the link between physical activity and breathing rate. Now, it's fairly simple. As you exercise and that increases, you move your limbs more. So muscle contraction increases and the need for energy increases. Therefore, you have to have more respiration in your cells, and carbon dioxide is made a lot more. This builds up in the muscles, and due to the high concentration in the muscles, it diffuses easily into the blood vessels. What happens is the brain then detects the spike of CO2 in the blood, and it makes your heart rate increase to start pumping more of that blood to the lungs. It will then also increase the breath rate and depth, which is called tidal volume, but we'll discuss that later in lesson. So the brain increases heart rate, then increases breath rate, the amount of breaths, and the depth of your breath. It does this by stimulating the diaphragm and the intercostal muscles to contract and relax rapidly. Therefore, in breathing in and breathing out more, getting more oxygen in for your respiring muscles and breathing more of the CO2 out to return the concentrations to normal levels. And then obviously the brain will reduce the heart rate and the breathing rate once levels return to normal. Okay, the last objective is objective K. Now, I think there's a mistake on your booklets with this, so just be aware that it will say objective J again. You've got to explain the role of how goblet cells and ciliated cells work together in the respiratory tract to stop pathogens from getting into your lungs. it's fairly straightforward. The goblet cells produce mucus, which traps dust and particles and pathogens from being breathed into the lungs and the alveoli. And then the ciliated cells have tiny hairs on, called cilia, which waft upwards towards the epiglottis. So they waft the mucus with the trapped bacteria or pathogens up towards the epiglottis. That would then be swallowed down the esophagus and digested and destroyed. This is just a picture of the ciliated cells with all the hairs there, not very clear, and then the goblet cells are just underneath, and you can see them. There's a tiny pore there where it would secrete mucus onto the lining of the epithelial cell. So